Welcome back to Buddhist PhD Responds. I'm Dr. Jared Jones, and in the upcoming clip, GodLogic, otherwise known as Avery Austin Jr., who is a tremendous young defender of the Christian faith and a ferocious debater, is talking to a young Buddhist on the street who didn't seem fully prepared to answer his questions. And as I want to do in this series, I'm going to do my best to provide an answer that has a little bit more context, a little bit more experience, a little bit more time and thinking behind it.
We're talking about life itself. We're talking about why there is life in the first place. Life always comes from life. That's a scientific principle. Yeah. So if life always comes from life, then the first life in the universe comes from an original life source. That's just what we've observed scientifically.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that would mean that the physical life that we see here had to come from something beyond that, a life that is beyond that. Mm-hmm. Which, what would you call that? What does that point? That points to a life beyond our realm, is what I'm saying.
I think you have a great point. Mm-hmm. I think you're making some great points right now.
Yeah.
The only point of contention I would say is, like how there's so many answers to that question.
There's not. That's the point. There isn't. Like there's okay. Let me ask you.
There's Christianity. There's Islam, Judaism.
Oh, so you're at, like so basically you're saying who is that? You're saying who is that God, or how do you know that your God is the right one? That's basically what you're asking, right?
Not necessarily. I'm just saying there's like how can you put an answer on it necessarily? Any one of these. How can you put an answer on
evidence? If we follow where the evidence leads. If the evidence shows that one, there is a source of life. Evidence points to a source of life, so we know that a life exists beyond us. That is the source of all life. And then we look at the evidence for who that life is. Is it who the Christians claim it is? Is it who the Muslims claim it is? Buddhists? What is the evidence? Where does the evidence lead?
So there's this question of life, and where does life come from? Let's take a look at some resources. If we go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and we look up this question of what is life, scrolling down to contemporary definitions of life, the takeaway from current understandings of the definition of life is that there is no consensus forthcoming in the near future. Put briefly, no one can agree on what life is, and life in different contexts has different definitions. This is also a critical component of establishing the ground on which this debate is happening between Avery and this young Buddhist. So let's take a look at that. In a book entitled Social and Conceptual Issues in Astrobiology, edited by Kelly C. Smith and Carlos Mariscal, the last 3,000 years of debate and discussion on life can be summarized as three critical definitions. Biological life shares traits with all other cellular life on Earth, archaea, eubacteria, and eukarya. Internal or conscious life shares subjective interiority with humans. Rational life shares intellect with all minds that can distinguish truth from non-truth. So we have three categories of life: biological, conscious, and rational. And rational fits into conscious. You can't have a rational life if you're not already conscious. So what Avery is saying, I think, is that to explain the existence in particular of conscious beings like us who have rational capabilities, you need something in the causal continuum prior to that that is similar to that in order to bring it into being. Now, where the Buddhists will agree with Avery is this. As I've done in previous videos on the hard problem of consciousness, when you investigate consciousness from a first-person perspective, it doesn't seem to share very much in common with matter. Consciousness seems to violate the laws of physics as we understand them, and neurobiologists still don't claim to have explained fundamental types of consciousness, despite mapping huge amounts of conscious activity to the brain. So how is so-called mental consciousness, not your five external senses, but the mind itself in isolation, defined in Buddhism? This is a tremendous resource, Study Buddhism, highly, highly recommended to you. According to the Buddhist definition, mind is mere clarity and awareness, and refers to the individual subjective mental activity of experiencing things. Clarity means giving rise to cognitive appearances of things similar to mental holograms, and awareness refers to cognitively engaging with them. According to Buddhism, it is consciousness that moves on from lifetime to lifetime. And when investigated carefully, it is consciousness that came from a previous life. And so the explanation for the arising of life in the sense of conscious life and rational life in the universe, according to Buddhists, is not a external power who has conscious and rational life, i.e. a creator God. It is conscious beings whose minds have been carrying on as a causal process from beginningless time.
At least the monks that I've met. I'm Theravada Buddhist, so that's like the original one.
Yeah.
They don't really try to put answers on anything.
Yeah. They kind of leave it up and
Leave it up to ambiguity.
Yeah,
and,
they don't really claim there's a God and stuff.
I don't need an answer.
The cosmos undergoes two major periods of change in time called the eons of expansion and contraction. The eon of expansion is the period in which the universe unfolds itself or opens out. The other is the one in which the universe closes in and is destroyed. It's also important to note that the idea that this universe is not the first universe also exists in modern physics, mainly championed by this physicist by the name of Roger Penrose, who's quite well known, lots of interviews, lots of debates, lots of discussions, even with Christian theologians. So this is not simply a Buddhist idea. There are some physicists who think there might have been another universe before this one, and at least according to Roger Penrose's math, there's no reason to think that the universe that came before this one was the first one, that there are countless beginningless universes going back as far as we can mathematically see. According to Buddhism, the exquisitely precise fine-tuning of the universe for the emergence of life and consciousness is expressed in the so-called anthropic principle. So this is not due to the creative principle, i.e. the creative power of a deity, but instead is due to the interdependence of matter with flows of consciousness, the two having coexisted for all time. So the reason that the universe is fine-tuned for beings like us to exist is because beings like us have karma, and through the collective work of all of our karma, the universe comes into being in such a way that we can all exist in it. Additionally, this doesn't settle the debate. However, quantum physicists have begun talking about the world in very much the way that I just described, that the inanimate world is a single physical system governed by quantum mechanics. There is good evidence that particles cannot exist independent of measurement devices and in particular conscious observers that measure them. John von Neumann laid the groundwork for this idea in quantum mechanics. He was later followed by Fritz London, Edmund Bauer, and Eugene Wigner, who boldly carried on von Neumann's argument to its logical conclusion. If we wholeheartedly accept Neumann's argument, they say, a consciousness-created reality is the inevitable outcome. Taking a slightly different approach, Max Planck famously said, I regard consciousness as fundamental and matter as derivative from consciousness. Notable physicists like J.A. Wheeler have also argued for the special status of consciousness in the existence of physical events. And these sit alongside developments in quantum mechanics like the development of many minds' interpretation of quantum mechanics, physics journals publishing articles with physicists and philosophers contributing to the idea that quantum mechanics and consciousness both challenge classical objectivist views of science. And finally, academic articles in philosophy using quantum mechanics to describe mind and matter as dual aspects of reality. So these ideas are not simply some strange foreign Buddhist concept. Even though this is a minority opinion in the academy, it's a view that's still held by very serious physicists and philosophers. It's not simply a Buddhist view. It may indeed be the case that conscious beings and the world at large cannot be pulled apart from one another. For Christians who think, isn't this problematic because you're creating the universe by committee? Shouldn't the universe be 50 million different kinds of things to different people all the time? Well, yes and no. According to Buddhism, there are individual streams of karma, and there are collective karmas. So there are types of karma that we accumulate that are just tailored to ourselves, whose results are experienced fully by ourselves in some sense. And there are collective karmas. In other words, we all did something together, and the results of that will unfold for us together. So for Buddhists, this explains the fine-tuning of the universe, and it explains why we experience conscious life in the universe. Not because of an external deity, but because of the collective action of the non-physical consciousness and karma of all sentient beings. And if you're wondering if this has anything to do with many worlds theory, in my opinion, it definitely doesn't have anything to do with many worlds theory. But let me tell you this. Buddhists have for a long time in the modern world clung on to this idea of many worlds theory as if it has something to do with Buddhist cosmology, and it doesn't. Many worlds theory, which is the idea that there are countless worlds out there, is completely different from the idea that there is an infinite causal sequence of universes running in a linear way.
Like, I mean, what do you think happens after you die?
I don't know. I have to find out.
If there was a heaven and hell was real, wouldn't you want to know that? You wouldn't want to wait till you die to find out.
I guess I would want to know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no way to know that till I die.
No, that's not true, brother, because we have somebody that's came and told us, he died, rose again on the third day and told us, hey guys, there is an afterlife, there is a heaven and a hell, and you have to, believe and live a certain way in order to come where I plan to bring you, as Jesus Christ. Jesus died and he rose again. I choose to believe what he says. And he tells us that he says, whoever believes in me, I'm preparing a place for you, and I'll take you back to myself. So he assures us of that. It's not guesswork.
Yeah, so that they would take me.
You know what I'm saying?
I mean, that's a dude from 2,000 years ago, How am I supposed to believe that?
What do you mean? How are you supposed to believe that?
I don't know. It just sounds like a story.
What do you think history is?
When we're looking at a text like the Bible, we have to look at all of the issues surrounding historical critical study of the Bible. And having studied historical critical methods for investigating the Bible as part of my master's work, I can tell you that the issue, for example, of quote-unquote original text is a very, very, very difficult issue, despite the fact that Christians very often, in particular in the public sphere, will make statements and claims like, we have 95 or 98% of the Bible based upon so-called 5,000 manuscripts. By the way, a manuscript can be a piece of text as big as a credit card. The oldest manuscript we have of the Bible is called P52, and this is it. That's a manuscript. One of my favorite approaches to biblical hermeneutics was written by Gary Martin, where he describes this concept of multiple originals. The idea being that even if you found an extremely early text of the Hebrew Bible, for example, you would still be in the unenviable position of trying to answer, what do we mean when we use the term original? Because it may be the case, for example, that biblical authors wrote multiple versions of their own text. It may be the case that at a later time, biblical authors edited their texts since those texts became important to their communities. Or it may be the case that the immediate followers of these people heard them saying things that contradicted their earliest versions of their own texts and changed their text to fit what their teachers had later explained that was not very well explained in a previous draft. Anyone who's done serious work on anything academic will understand exactly what I mean by all this. And so when the young man asks, how can we trust these historical documents, I do feel his pain. However, Avery also has a point. As human beings, one type of knowledge that we rely upon is the direct experience of other people that we think are authorities in that area. And so when Avery says, if somebody came to you and said, heaven is real, hell is real, isn't that something you'd want to know so that you could adjust your behavior before you die? I think most of us, if those were real places and somebody had special knowledge of those places, would be very much interested to hear whatever is required to end up in the nicer place and not end up in the worst place. Likewise, in Buddhism, unknown to the younger gentleman and perhaps also unknown to Avery, there are heavens and hells being described. There are a host of other realms, in fact. However, none of them are permanent. This is one major difference, but there are several major differences. Furthermore, there are Buddhist saints of modern times, like Venerable Mahabua, for example, who described that during his enlightenment experience, he recalled all of his past lives, and then his mind reached out and observed all other beings in existence, as the Buddha's mind did when he achieved enlightenment. And what he experienced was beings going up and down and experiencing unbelievable bliss and unbelievable suffering. And his heart was absolutely broken by this. There's an incredible video of him describing all of this on YouTube. For the uninitiated, however, I want to give you a different line of evidence that's a little easier to get your hands around than the direct personal experiences of yogis. At the University of Virginia, since the 1960s, there's been an ongoing research study into children who remember past lives. And those research studies have produced academic articles all the way up to 2025 that have been published quite often in reputable journals of psychology, going back as far as 1960. There are 107 articles of this kind, and there are 430 that fit into the much broader study of things like near-death experience, for example. Now, of course, I agree. This research is a little bit on the edge. However, when you look at the self-reflectiveness of the people doing the research, and when you look at the fact that a fair number of these children have to overcome major objections from the religious elements of their family to come forward with these stories, and when you look at the great lengths and pains that researchers go to attempt to verify whether or not the claims being made by the children, specific claims about their previous rebirths, can be verified or not, it builds a compelling case. Dr. Jim Tucker, who runs the Childhood Past Life Memory Program at the University of Virginia, wrote this book, Life Before Life. It's really fantastic, highly recommended, and in it he has some of their best case studies with the most extraordinary details of children remembering things that are highly specific about their previous rebirth, including, for example, the private pet names that person used for their children that no one outside of their family knew, or where the previous person had hidden money around the house of a previous rebirth. Furthermore, children with past life memories quite often have scars that match the manner of death from the previous life. Additionally, aligning with Buddhist texts, children with past life memories often carry over habits, interests, and preferences from a previous rebirth. So I do agree with Avery to a degree, as a Buddhist, that we should take the first-person reports of people on board. However, I agree with the young Buddhists that we can't simply take the word of people in historical sources that all of this was true. Thankfully, in the case of Buddhism, we have examples like Venerable Mahabua and other examples like children with past life memories, even from the Christian tradition, by the way, that can give us some reasoned confidence that rebirth is real and realms of rebirth are also real. Let's quickly recap what we covered so far. Avery was saying that you need a source of life to explain the existence of life in the universe. It wasn't quite clear to me whether he was talking about biological life, conscious life, or rational life, but it was pretty clear that he was talking about a creator God giving rise to beings like us and probably also biological life. The young Buddhist gentleman didn't really understand, as far as I could tell, the Buddhist position on these issues. The material universe, including non-conscious biological life, comes about due to the collective karma and the individual karmas of all sentient beings. This is why the universe is fine-tuned for our existence, because it comes into existence in relationship to us. Secondly, this universe is not beginningless. This universe has a beginning, but there's no reason to think that simply because there's a Big Bang over here, that there's nothing behind that Big Bang. From a Buddhist standpoint, the universe doesn't pop into existence out of nothing. Rather, it comes from a previous type of existence with some similar qualities. And in particular, it comes from the collective and individual karma of sentient beings who have existed since beginningless time. Avery then also said, if someone told you what the afterlife was going to be like, isn't that something you would want to know? And I pointed out that there are great Buddhist saints in modern times like Venerable Mahabua who have indeed themselves, through their training in meditation, spending decades in training in meditation, have broken through to actually seeing how things are, according to Buddhists. And as part of that experience, you have a direct perception of all your past lives, and you have a direct perception of all of the ways in which sentient beings are moving up and down through the realms of rebirth according to their karma. These are two of the enlightenment experiences that the Buddha had. Venerable Mahabua said this is also what happened to him. In addition to that, look at the University of Virginia's research. This idea that people are reincarnated is not just some weird Buddhist thing. People from every culture, both religious and non-religious, from multiple religions, have children who make these kinds of claims. I think that's fairly good evidence for the existence of rebirth. Let me make my argument a little more formally now. Roughly speaking, there are mental things and physical things in reality. It is your mind, which is non-physical, that goes from lifetime to lifetime. In order for each new moment of your consciousness to arise, you have to put forward the reason that there was a moment of your consciousness prior to this one, giving rise to the current moment of awareness. In the case of the physical universe, it's a little bit different because in the formative stages of the universe, it's arising in relation to all of the conscious beings who will later inhabit that universe, so it's a bit different. But once those particles have arisen, likewise they exist in a causal continuum where the previous moment of a particle causes the next moment of a particle in a quantized way. This is actually called momentariness in Buddhist philosophy and has been part of our literature since, I think, at least the 6th century. When you ask physicists, they don't say that nothing existed before this universe. They say that you can't see past the singularity of the Big Bang. And there are at least a few physicists, like Dr. Penrose, who say that there's some chance, some possibility, that there are beginningless, infinite universes behind this one. And that's the Buddhist position. So in brief, why do we see conscious things now and physical things now? Because there's a causal continuum that goes back in time where mental and physical things are causing more mental and physical things. So as long as we simply accept that existence exists and has always existed in some form, then we actually have a complete explanation, except for the fact that we can't explain why existence itself exists. Turning to the Christian position now. If we say that you need something outside the system to explain the system, we haven't actually solved the fundamental problem that existence itself seems to demand an explanation. If we say that there is a timeless, immaterial, powerful, cognizant, intelligent, good deity that exists, well, now we once again have the problem of existence itself to deal with. And I'm not actually saying that that deity itself must be caused. I'm simply saying that you haven't actually fixed this fundamental problem that you claim is the problem with my position. My position is existence exists, and as long as we are comfortable saying, well, we don't have a good explanation for why existence as a whole exists, we're okay. However, if you say, well, I'm not okay with that, I'd like an explanation for how that exists, and to explain that, I'm going to invoke something else that has the exact same problem, i.e., it exists, and it's always existed, and doesn't need an explanation for its existence. I think you haven't actually solved the problem. The way that theologians attempt to solve this problem is by saying that this being is a necessary being. What they mean by this is that the rest of reality is contingent in the sense that it could have turned out some other way, it may not have existed, it depends upon causes, and that deity doesn't need or depend upon anything else whatsoever. This introduces a few additional problems which can be revealed if you look at the nature of that deity. The nature of that deity, in terms of how it exists, must be either changing or unchanging. And once again, I'm not talking about its attributes. A thing exists as a being, and then it has qualities or attributes as part of its being. I'm talking about its nature. If there's a creator deity, the nature of its existence must either be changing or unchanging. Generally speaking, even when you look at great theologians like Aquinas, there's this strong recognition from 2,000 years of philosophical thinking that changing things come from other changing things. In other words, they're caused. Unchanging things can't come from something else because that would require interaction, change, a doing, a moving. And thus, Aquinas, for example, labeled the creator deity as an unmoved mover, a causeless cause. I don't think he said that, but Other theologians have made these kinds of statements, and you can find them all throughout the literature. But what this is actually saying is that this deity breaks the laws of logic, reason, and reality as we understand them. So you've introduced a new thing that exists. In other words, it has the same problem as reality. It seems to exist without an explanation for how and why it exists in the first place, except that your explanation breaks all of the rules of reality as we understand them. And my explanation abides by all of the rules of reality as we understand them. All you need to make my explanation work as a Buddhist is that causality continues beyond that wall of the Big Bang that you can't see through. What you need to make this other explanation work is that for at least one being in reality, they don't need to be interdependent in the same way as everything else. They don't need to abide by the laws of causality as the same way as everything else. They don't need to abide by the laws of logic the same way as everything else. So with my explanation, the Buddhist explanation, you have an infinite series of causes that don't have an explanation for why they exist in the first place, but there is no first place because they've always existed. There's no first. It's an infinite causal chain. In the other example, you have a deity whose existence also can't be explained, but within the nature of that deity, they break all of the laws and rules of reality as we understand them. So I think between the two options, the one that doesn't break all the rules of reality is probably the better one. To just hammer this home one more time, my explanation involves changing things, caused things, giving rise to more caused things over and over and over and over again, which is all that we have ever observed in the entire history of our observations of science and probably also spiritual practice, right? We have never observed a causeless, uncaused, non-interdependent thing giving rise to anything. Now, of course, on the other side of the aisle, they might retort that we don't observe infinite things even in nature. However, we don't really know if that's true. There's so little that we actually know about nature. To say that there are no infinities in nature, I think, is premature. A much more sticky objection might be, could an infinite causal sequence reach the present moment? Some have argued that since there are an infinite number of moments in the past, in other words, since the first moment of reality would be infinitely in the past, it couldn't reach the present moment. Imagine there was an infinite number of dominoes stretched out behind you, and you asked, how far am I from the nearest domino? There would be a finite answer to that question. And then if you ask, well, what about the second domino? How far am I from that one? That's a finite answer. And then if you asked billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dominoes back, how about that one? How far am I from that domino? You'd find that's also a finite number. And therefore, given enough time, that domino, if you flicked it, would reach the present moment. There is no domino that is itself an infinite distance from you. There are only specific instances of dominoes that are finite distances from you. And therefore, every one of these dominoes, in an infinite series of dominoes behind you, infinite rebirths, infinite universes, could in fact logically reach the present moment. And by logical necessity, would have to reach the present moment because every single one of them is only a finite distance from you. Even though they are infinite in number, they are not infinite in causal distance. This is the critical point.
To wrap things up, I'd just like to say I have great respect for my Christian colleagues, and I'm not attacking Avery, GodLogic, in any way. But remember when he said this.
So what is the evidence? Where does the evidence lead?
We now used multiple lines of evidence to support two Buddhist positions. One, the origin of life, by way of explaining that each individual stream of consciousness is non-physical and has been reborn an infinite number of times. And number two, the origin of this current universe as the end result of an infinite causal chain of consciousness, and previous universes. I think the evidence points in one particular direction. What do you think?
With that, I think I have presented a little bit better answer to the questions being raised by GodLogic. And as usual, I'm Dr. Jared Jones. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you again soon.